Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Council's Strategy, Resources and Performance Committee. I hope we're all right to go. Are we live? I was even early.
Chair, I can hear you clearly, but I think it's because I'm sitting very closely to you. Could you just move it a bit closer to you?
Yeah, sure. Is that better?
You're starting to pick it up, yeah.
The council allows filming and photography at its public meetings, so please feel free to take pictures and use social media during the meeting. Can I ask, though, that everyone present turns their mobile phones to silent or vibrate while the meeting is taking place? Please be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and that a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the council's website. There is no fire alarm test scheduled for today, so if the alarm sounds, I will adjourn the meeting and we will leave via the side doors and use the fire escape next to the kitchen to make our way to the assembly point in the car park. Agenda item number 1 is apologies for absence and declarations of interest. Michelle.
I have apologies from Councillor Mark Goldsack.
Thank you. It looks as if we have everyone else present and correct, so that's great. Any declarations of interest? If there are not, if at any point anyone feels they need to disclose anything, please feel free to say so during the meeting. Item 2 is the minutes and action log. We are being asked to approve the minutes of the Strategy and Resources Performance Committee on the 17th of December as an accurate record. If any member does not agree, could you raise your hand now? I see no hands, so we will approve the minutes as an accurate record. Are there any comments on the action log? Councillor Count.
Thank you, Chair. Minute number 236 on page 13 is regarding the sprinkler system at Alconbury Weald. As you recall, there was a recommendation from the CYP committee to build the school with the recommendation to build the school without sprinklers was rejected. This then came to SRP committee, which asked for more money to be put in the budget, which should have come with more money to be put in the budget for sprinklers, but the recommendation was actually to reject the CYP position and to say we will build without sprinklers. We put an amendment into that, and both the recommendation to move ahead without sprinklers and our recommendation therefore was withdrawn as a way forward was sought. We have a minute regarding the report back to Children and Young People Committee, but I wish to ask you, Chair, what is your understanding now of the position whether we are moving forward with or without a design with sprinklers? Thank you, Chair.
My understanding is that we're moving forward for a design with sprinklers, and that a new design is being brought forward for the building.
In which case, Chair, could we ask that the action log is amended to reflect that? Because the action log is amended as complete. It makes no reference whatsoever to the fact that we're moving with sprinklers, and the report that goes back to the CYP committee that is referred actually talks about the apology from the officer and the fact that there was a miscommunication on one subject. And it says that feedback will be given at the end of the design period, but it actually is completely silent on whether the design is moving ahead with or without sprinklers. So considering the confirmation you've just given me and from the nods from Michael Hudson, if we could have it put in our minutes that we are moving ahead with sprinklers at Alconbury Weald, and then we will get feedback on the full design. I would appreciate that.
Thank you. I don't think there's any problem with amending the action log to reflect that the new situation is that there will be a new design with sprinklers, and I think Michelle is happy with that. I think it's difficult to change the minutes because we've already agreed them. Michelle.
Apologies. Just to clarify, I can make reference in the minutes of this meeting so that it's recorded. There is no point, unless somebody tells me differently, amending the action log because it's complete as regards the response. So I will take it out of the action log and just reference it as a record in the minutes, if that's okay.
Are you content with that?
With a follow-up question on the same subject, which may or may not be according to that. So if you look at the actual action, there was a part about the relation to the sprinklers at CYPC, and then the further part was and whether any further action was required in terms of budgeting. Now, we've avoided the committee system at the last meeting by removing everything. We now know that you're moving ahead with the design. There have been no actions taken with regard to budgeting and no committee decisions on this subject. So can I ask where we are with regards to that? Thank you, Chair.
I'll ask Michael to answer that one.
Thank you, through you, Chair. At this moment in time, the design will be reworked within budget. Clearly, if following that and other design matters that need to come back to committee, then that will come back to committee.
Councillor Camp.
Thank you, Chair. In which case, first of all, I'd like to express my thanks at the way that we found to move forward, which is actually to try and value design the sprinklers into the design. I may remind this committee that was the actual amendment to the recommendation the Conservatives put forward at the last time that got removed, and it's now been accepted, not through the committee system, but just accepted. I'm not going to quibble about whose decision it should or shouldn't be, because we seem to have avoided the committee here, but I am going to say thank you that this is finally seeing some sense. Thank you.
That's great. Good. Any further comments on the action log? No further comments. So thank you very much for that. We will move on to item 3, which is petitions and public questions. We've received no petitions and public questions, and we will therefore move on to item 4, which is the integrated finance monitoring report for the period 8. And Stephen Howarth has arrived beautifully timely to present that report. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. This report presents, as usual, the consolidated management accounts of the Council for period 8 of 2024-25, which is the end of November. It sets out the forecast revenue and capital budget position for the current year and summarises the relevant parts of the balance sheet for the Council. Committee is just asked to review and comment on this report today, so I'll summarise the key points for you. On the revenue position, at period 8, the Council is forecasting an overspend of £6.8 million, or 1%, improved from a £7.5 million forecast overspend when we came last month. In previous reports to this committee, and again through this report, we've brought to members' attention the pressures that this council, like many nationally, are facing from services such as placements for children in care and home to school transport. In those services, increasing demand is outstripping supply and driving up costs. The other key drivers of the overspend remain as they were in the previous period, with pressures on waste disposal, lower than expected income on some of the key income generation pieces of work, and higher than expected capital financing costs, the latter of which has worsened in the forecast since last month. These continue to be offset partly through predominantly lower than expected demand for adult social care services this year, particularly older people services, the extent of which has increased since last month and is the main driver of the improved position, and additional funding from government grants and business rates above the budgeted level. As usual, Appendix 1 to the main annex provides the committee with detailed commentaries from officers on budget lines that are forecast to have material outturn variances. The forecast on the Council's dedicated schools grant remains unchanged at a forecast in-year pressure of just over £18 million, which would bring the cumulative deficit there to just over £58 million. Turning to capital, the Council continues to forecast a balanced position on the capital programme this year. While 2 directorates are forecasting small underspends across the whole programme, we broadly expect to come in on budget. It's worth noting that capital spend this year in areas with the largest budgets, particularly education and highways, in those areas spend is taking place faster than we've seen in recent years, and as a result we are not seeing the level of forecast underspend in those services that we've seen at similar stages of recent years. Commentaries on schemes that have got a material forecast variance can be seen in Appendix 2 of the main annex. Then finally, Chair, on the balance sheet, the report sets out the earmarked reserves, borrowing and debt position, which remain broadly unchanged since the report we brought at the previous period. But I'll leave the intro there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Any questions for Stephen on the report? Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Mine are mainly around the safety valve and the changes to the safety valve. If I go to page 28, table 2.1.1 in the revenue budget, my understanding is from column 1 that on the safety, on the variance on children, education and families was 11.7 million. And this is November papers, and it's gone to 18.4 million. I've found some narrative that deals with this, but I'm unclear why there's such a massive jump in such a short period of time. That doesn't seem to be covered by any narrative. So could I either be pointed to that, or could we have an explanation why it's gone, as far as I can see, from 11.7 to 18.4 within that short time period?
So I should begin with a small apology there, Chair. I've clearly got my months slightly mixed up. This report does bring an increased forecast overspend, as Councillor Count has pointed out, on the dedicated schools grant, not a continued position of £18 million, as I said in the introduction. The report attempts to set out the reasons for the change at 2.2.5, which is on page 30 of the pack. So following a sort of fundamental review of the forecasts on the DSG funded budgets halfway through the year, through increased growth and demand for those services and increased costs, we are seeing an increased forecast overspend there.
Thank you, Chair. So 2.2.5, which was the paragraph that I identified, it does go over the fact of why there is an overspend. Right? I think you've just introduced into that narrative that there was an in-depth analysis. So basically, from what I understand, that in the period of 1 month, you revised the figures. The figures were so shockingly out that this has increased an £11 million overspend to an £18 million overspend, not because of changes that happened in the 1 month, but actually because you've looked at the actual background to the figures and discovered that they're in error, and therefore you've got a new prediction for the end of year, which is £7 million out. Is that correct?
I'd probably categorise it that we've done a review. As with all forecasting for demand-led budgets, they're only a best guess at, or best estimate at a point in time. And following, detailed work that was done in the period, that that forecast was revised up. Yes, but it's not to say that the previous forecast was wrong per se. It's just based on the latest information available, and the academic year aspect of dedicated schools grant funded budgets results in the partway through the year being a very opportune time to do a fundamental review of the forecast on them.
Michael, do you want to add a little?
Chair, that was exactly the point that Stephen just picked up there at the end. Obviously, with children moving through the school or leaving school at various points in terms of post-16 and post young adult education, we are aware of that quite early in the process in terms of, kind of June, July, August positions. We're able to adjust for that. The September intake then, in terms of the assessment and processing of that, often means that data is coming through in November and December. So it's not unusual to see these high level of changes, not just at Cambridgeshire, but at other organisations.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, accepting that position that we now understand, the safety valve system that you negotiated with, that this administration negotiated with the minister, is wildly off track, and you are trying to negotiate a new position. The new position has been negotiated, I think, probably for the last 6-8 months. It's been realised that it's been off track, and we've been trying to negotiate a new position. A lot of the issues with the data and the predictions, and those discussions have been ongoing. What was DfE's reaction when, having negotiated for 4 or 5 months, in the last month you've suddenly presented them with another £7 million variance? Thank you.
Michael.
Chair, thank you. Obviously, discussions continue with the Department for Education, both around our position, but also the national position. Councillors may be aware, but if not, the safety valve programme has now been closed for new entrants, and the DfE are presently reviewing the whole high needs and SEND position. I will come on to it in the next item in terms of the statutory override, and that is resulting in, or or an expectation that we will see significant reform nationally led around high needs and the centre position, which should give us some clarity. What that means is that's therefore affecting our ability to move forward with the DFE while it has got those positions to resolve. In terms of our own position, we continue to have good discussions with the Department for Education. These are not out of the norm in terms of what they have seen at other safety valve authorities or at delivering better value authorities or other authorities in general, and therefore they weren't surprised at that, but continue to be focused on our Inclusion for All programme and how that can better address the needs of children and young adults in Cambridgeshire, but also address the ongoing position. But we'll wait the national position with interest.
Steve.
Thank you very much for that feedback. I've got one last question, and you'll forgive me if it's slightly parochial, but it's related to this issue. So one of the aspects of the safety valve overspend, and I must point out that we have established in previous committees, this is a minor aspect and not a major one, but it's still an aspect, is the late delivery of the special needs schools. One of those special needs schools apparently funded by the Department for Education is to be built in my own area of March, and it's absolutely vital that it goes ahead. I've recently been informed, and I don't know why I didn't pick this up earlier. I've asked for clarification on whether any communications went to me, but apparently the Labour government paused that when they took office, and I've heard nothing since, and I've asked offline. So I was wondering if officers have any information on what discussions are going on with DFE with regard to unpausing and building the special educational needs school that is vital in the March area. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'm going to suggest is that we ask for a briefing note to be done for the whole of this committee and potentially for all members on where we are with the safety valve programme, on the position for all the SEND schools, actually, because they are an absolutely crucial part of that programme, including the one in March, but also all of the other ones, because I think understanding where we are in the process of increasing that the provision within our area for special needs education is something that will not just be of interest to you because of the one in March, but be of interest probably to all members and many members of the public, because it's absolutely crucial both to providing better education for the children with special educational needs in our county and also to the county's finances. I will come to you in a moment, Richard, but would you be happy with that as a step forward? And certainly I'm sure that we can get you information on the one in March.
Yeah, I believe that's correct approach, Chair, and I do believe that Labour government paused all of the special educational needs schools, not just the one in March.
Just briefly, obviously, I've got no specific knowledge or comment to make about the specific school in March. Thank you for your summing up there, and I think that is a good solution. But I think it is important to place on record that every authority that has negotiated a safety valve is in exactly the same position that we are. Essentially, special needs education is not being funded nationally at the level it is needed to be. The government has accepted that. It's already put £1 billion extra in the budget into this area, but accepts that can only be the first step. And so I wouldn't want anyone locally to be under the impression that there's some sort of local overspending that's a problem. This is a national problem that we're sharing in, and which our officers are very well aware of, and which is party to the negotiations that are taking place between us and the Department for Education. And we should be very, very well aware that parents, children themselves and parents of children with disabilities listen to discussions like this, and it's really important to reassure them that this is a well-managed service seeking to do its best with some real challenges and to respect the challenges that those families face themselves.
Thank you. Yes, Lisa, you may.
Just a very tiny thing to add. I think it's important to note that it is quite normal for the government departments, all of them, to pause and review all their capital programs when a new government comes in. So that's what happened in all departments, not just the FE, notwithstanding the FE's own special challenges as just outlined. And as exemplified by the recently unpaused hospital to the south of Cambridge, these things come to be unpaused gradually, and I would expect that to be no different. So, we will do the actions that the chair has taken, and I think that's quite important.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those important questions on, I think that was still the action. Oh, no, it was the integrated finance and performance report. I think, the safety valve program and the impact that that's having on our finances is an absolutely critical issue for this council. So thank you for raising it, and we will get more information on the special schools and on the program more broadly. Are there any more questions on the integrated performance, finance and performance report? I don't see any. I just wanted to, as I often do, thank Stephen and the finance team for the phenomenal amount of work that has gone into getting the overspend to come down slightly. I think it's difficult to overemphasize how difficult it is to stop it from rising when it is kind of in that position. So I know that right across the council, there's been an enormous amount of work that's gone into controlling costs in the latter half of the year in order to prevent that overspend from increasing in the way that it has done. So I would like to put on record my thanks to the finance team for all the work they've done on this, but also actually to officers across the council who I know of, some of whom have had a somewhat grim time going through all their finances with a fine-tooth comb in order to make sure that they are controlling spending. And we do appreciate it, and we know it is not fun. So thank you very much for that work. I think it looks as if that's the summary of the debate on that item. So thank you very much, Stephen. We will then move, we just note it, don't we? We don't need a vote on that one. We will move on to the finance and sustainability assessment, Michael, which is for you.
Thank you, Chair. And this report forms part of my statutory duties under Section 25 of the 2003 Act. And it's to inform councillors both in terms of the next item on this committee and the discussion that will take place in terms of the budget and precept on the 11th of February at full council. And the opinion is needed to be set around the robustness of those estimates and the adequacy of the level of reserves. Paragraph 2.5 sets out the structure of how I've approached expressing the opinion. It's worth drawing out a few points, both in terms of learning from this current year and issues for members to note. First being that this identifies there is a need to recognise continued improvement in controls, including the savings tracker and the delivery of that in as we've seen in 24-25 going into 25-26, and what you will have seen in the last report as well as going forward is the a strengthening of controls around both workforce and third-party spends during this year, which will continue into next year. At Section 3, I've also set out how the risk register that is also considered by this committee and the corporate risks are reflected in the earmark reserves flowing from paragraph 3.15 and the bullets that sit below that. As part of that assessment, I would like to draw members' attention to paragraphs 3.16 and 3.17 in terms of the basis of my assessment. That is due to the position related to the statutory override related to the dedicated schools grant high needs block element, which at this present moment in time enables to discount that as being a draw on the council's general fund balance. That override is due to end the 1st of April 2026. We were expecting an announcement by the government as part of the provisional settlement, which was announced on the 18th of December. That announcement only made clear that the decision around the override will only be determined once it is clear that there is a reform in the funding and policy structure. As such, as I sit here today, I don't have any further advice to offer to members. Therefore, what I've done at 3.16 is make an assumption that government will take a number of courses of action, and those courses of action that I am assuming will either be to resolve the deficit or to continue the override, and therefore it will not fall onto the general fund. If that is not the case, I will need to revisit this assumption. That is quite clear to me. And what I can also confirm to members is that we have agreed this position both at the Association of Local Authority Treasurers and Society of County Treasurers, recognising that this issue is not solely isolated to Cambridgeshire County Council. This is a national issue which the Ministry of Housing, Local Government and Communities is well aware of. Other points to note that overall our financial standing, as reflected in the SIPFA resilience indicators, is in line with our peers, even after such risks that we face and have continued to face around demand and inflation, and that those pressures have been recognised from 24-25 going into the setting of the 25-26 budget. It's important to note that in the assessment of the reserves, I've looked both at the current but also at the future period. Some of those are known, some of those are unknown. And I'm pleased to report that funding is available to support change, but that excludes local government reorganisation, which at this stage remains a white paper and will be needing to work through. But clearly the change programme that came here in terms of our future council in October and the strategy that was agreed there would be a key driver whether there was local government reform or not, and that has to be a key pillar in terms of our resources to fund that. We also have resources set aside for the uncertainty around the funding reform, which was also announced at the provisional settlement, which will come into play for 26-27. We are actively engaged in those discussions with MHCLG and will continue to report that through the 26-27 business and budget planning process. Few other points. School deficits remain in need of monitoring, as do emerging structural changes at Greater Cambridge Partnership, and of course, as I've just mentioned, local government reorganisation. But as yet, there's no reason to look at reserves for that, but they will be a key point in the year ahead. And finally, changes are coming in through accounting technical matters, in particular IFRS 9, which will also need to be recognised in terms of our investments and how that flows through. And I make comments on that in the report. So overall, my conclusions are that the budget estimates are robust based on the information known at this present moment in time. The reserves are adequate, but they do need continual review in light of the medium-term challenges of both the known and the emerging risks. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Michael. It doesn't make very comfortable reading this year, this assessment. Comments or questions for Michael? Chris.
I've got a few questions and comments. Do you want questions first to Michael and then comments come later or all together? Okay. First of all, specifically for Michael, there's reference made in paragraph 3.30 about the external pressure for 25-6, the additional external pressure because of the employer's national insurance costs. Now, mention is made there that it's been provided within the council's workforce and pay budgets and, unfortunately, also for the adult social care supply chain. Now, the Chancellor did say that the costs would be entirely funded by central government. Then we got clarification that some parts of the public sector wouldn't be covered at all, such as parish councils. Then we realised that third parties, such as the supply chain we have in social care, won't be covered. And then when we got the the provisional settlement, we found that not even all of our direct additional costs were going to be covered. What I haven't been able to ascertain from all of that in relation to 25/6 is the extent to which, in terms of the value of the which was being taken into account in the budget so far as the 25/26 additional costs are concerned. And because it's split between so many departments and also with the external costs on the supply chain costs, I just haven't managed to work out how much that has hit us in 25/26. And I fully appreciate that there's no way of telling how it might hit us in 26/7 and beyond, because we don't know if government support for that will extend to 26/7 and beyond. So I'm not surprised that's not mentioned, because it's a complete unknown. But so far as 25/26 is concerned, given that it has been provided for within the budgets for next year, I'd be grateful to know what the total shortfall would be for 25/6. You'd like me to carry on with all my other points, or to get that one answered? It's a very specific point, that one. Carry on. Okay. In paragraph 3.15, I was not surprised to see reference was made to the local authority funding reform white paper, which was issued on the 18th of December. A lot of things were issued just before Christmas, and that one in particular was exceptionally disappointing, where the Labour government made it clear that they were going to be moving local government support from, and they didn't use these exact words, but the intent was quite clear, from richer areas to poorer areas. Now, it wasn't quite as explicit as that. There was talk within that of the tax fund, the tax base, which was available to different types of council and so on. But it was abundantly clear from what they said within that white paper that the intention of government, and it is a discussion paper, but of course a discussion paper where the government's made it quite clear what direction of travel it's going in. The discussion paper, it makes it quite clear that government is going to make that change. Now, I'm waiting to see when the amendment to this comes for London, because a lot of Labour authorities in London would lose out particularly heavily as far as this proposal is concerned, and I'm 100% confident that before it comes into effect, somehow we'll find an exception is given for London. But allowing for London, it's quite clear the direction that the government is going in, and we are going to face, thanks to this change in the which is being made by the government, a significant hit so far as our finances are concerned from 26/7 onwards, which will have its additional effect on our already rather precarious sustainability position. And it's really important that we make strong representations on this matter, because what we've been waiting for is a fairer funding formula, which will recognise the pressures that councils like us have in particular, which are the growth areas. And what government is coming out with is something which is almost opposite to what we would regard as fairer funding so far as that's concerned. So I'm looking forward to this council making very strong representations, including in response to the white paper, so far as that is concerned. I was pleased that Michael emphasised the importance of paragraphs 3.16 and 3.17 to do with the statutory override, and it is an exceptionally serious matter. Michael has made an assumption within 3.16, and he's been very explicit about the assumption that he's made in 3.17, and it's entirely appropriate for Michael to use his professional judgment as to what assumption to make. But that assumption, it may or may not play out as early as next month, maybe even before we have our budget meeting, Lucy, because we are told that in February there will be further announcements on this matter, which may or may not be in accordance with the assumption that Michael has made in 3.16 and 3.17. And Michael's been quite honest and open about this. He said that if the assumptions which are being made are not forthcoming, that is, that the override will continue beyond 1/4/26, or there will be some new funding which is available. If that's not the case, then we'll be looking at seeking exceptional financial support, failing which there'll be a Section 114 notice. Now, Michael's not hiding this, and he's been very explicit about his assumption, but the timing of information which is coming may be the case that is even before the budget meeting that we have in this council. If when the budget meetings take place at this council, there has been, even in the previous few days, an announcement which is not in accordance with the assumptions that Michael has made, then we have to look extremely carefully at the validity of the budget that we will have in front of us on that budget day. And I know the timing is awful on that, but it is of such fundamental importance. As Michael has said, it could result in a Section 114 notice ultimately. It's something that we've got to be very alert about. And when announcements are made, whether that be in February or later, obviously they will be of fundamental importance to the financial viability and the financial sustainability of this council. I read through this paper, and in part, and I don't mean to be funny about this because I know the papers are written many weeks in advance, and it's extremely difficult to change them in light of changes in circumstances. But in some parts, it almost looks like a fantasy paper. And the reason I say that isn't a criticism of officers, it's that this was written and this was composed and this was formulated in the months that we've had up till now, including before Christmas. And then, of course, in the week before Christmas, we had the announcement, the government white paper on devolution. And the government white paper on devolution makes it quite clear, a small part of that, or a subsidiary part of the government white paper on devolution is local government reform. And in that paper, it's abundantly clear, and as you know, Lucy, in communications there have been since then, it's abundantly clear that this council will not be in existence in 2030. So to have all of our forecasts and all of our sustainability figures on the basis of 2530 increasingly looks a little bit strange. I'll put it no more strongly than that, but I do appreciate how difficult it is for officers to rewrite papers because of a fundamental change which has been foisted upon us a little more than a month ago. But as far as 2530 is concerned, and that period, since we know that, and we believe that it's on the 31st of March 2028 that this council will cease to exist, then looking at the financial sustainability of this council, and for that matter, the financial sustainability of the entities which will succeed this council, which I believe we also have a responsibility for, it fundamentally changes the outlook so far as the assessment of sustainability is concerned. And I couldn't expect officers to rewrite the whole paper just because of that, but it's something which I think there needs to be recognition of, and we need to be particularly concerned about. And in some cases, we need really urgently to start changing or amending our policies so as to be cognizant of the change which takes place. And in particular, and specifically, one thing is to do with our procurement policy. And our procurement policy, we can't stop as a council. We have to carry on working up until the last day. We can't just say, oh, things are changing in 2028, let's stop the council. Things can't work like that. So we've got to carry on, not quite as usual necessarily, but we've got to carry on providing all the same services and, where necessary, procuring new contracts. And where you do procure new contracts, in many cases, you can't just procure them to the 31st of March 28. In order for them to be financially viable, you've got to procure them over a much longer period, 5 years, 10 years. We have longer than that, of course. And my request is, because this came out in the Adults and Health Committee last week, when we do now start procurement processes, and even those procurement processes which we're already undertaking, I think it's really important that consideration is given to the need for severance within those procurement processes, on the assumption, and it's a fairly good one but not certain, on the assumption that we may well find that any procurement exercise we go through and produces a contract, that contract itself will need to be subject to severance between different authorities after 31st March 28. Now, when we if we look at a neighbouring authority, Northamptonshire, and what happened with Northamptonshire when it was split into West Northamptonshire and North Northamptonshire, they had massive problems in dealing with the severance issues on the contracts that the county council had previously entered into. And now that we at least have 3 years' notice, I think it's incumbent upon us to consider, and I don't want to tell you how to do this because I must admit I can't fully work out how it can be done, but there are people better qualified and better experienced than I am to work it out. But it's really important that we give consideration now as to how we change our processes so that if and when severance takes place on the vesting day of the 1st of April 28, that the process is made at least slightly less difficult than would otherwise be the case. But this thing about existing beyond March 28 means that something like paragraph 3.46, where we talk about our future council and our change strategy up to 2030, we now need to look at that very carefully indeed. I'm not asking for it to be amended in here, but we need to amend our change strategy now to recognise the fact that we haven't got a 2030 anymore, but also that we need to be as sensible as possible to accommodate the entity or entities which are going to follow this county council. So I would ask that our future council and that whole strategy be re-looked at so that we can actually take into account the reality that we now unexpectedly face. And finally, my apologies for going on, but so far as paragraph 3.64 is concerned, and looking at the inheritance that we will be giving to our successor authority or authorities, our debt-income ratio is astonishingly poor. If we look at our statistical neighbours, the median figure that our statistical neighbours have as county councils in the debt-to-income ratio is 27%. Ours is 128%, almost 5 times worse. It's only worse in our statistical neighbours in Worcestershire, and they're only slightly worse, at 130%. And everything which can be done to try to keep our external debt down over the course of the next 3 years and 2 months should be done, because we shouldn't be lumbering our successor authorities with excessive debt. And to the extent that we can take action to make sure that that is, if not minimized, then at least ameliorated, I believe we've got a moral duty to do so. I'm sorry to have taken so long, Lucy. I hope some of the points I've made have been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. There are indeed a lot of points there, and I will come back to Michael to respond on some of the earlier ones, and then if you would like, I will respond on some of the later ones.
Thank you, Chair, and hopefully I've made a note of all those points, Councillor Bowden. So dealing with the first one, 3.30, the national insurance position, government announced that the national insurance grant, or whatever it is to be termed as part of the settlement, will be confirmed at the final settlement. So we still do not know that yet. That will be in the coming days. They are using what we understand to be quite simplistic formula based on some of the revenue return submissions, and simply they didn't have that full data for the provisional settlement. So we have an indication that it will be for us around about circa £2 million. We expect that our costs will be higher than that, although, of course, I think as was noted in earlier report, the pay award was slightly lower than where we expected it to be in terms of the national position, and that gave us that balancing position. We also have the market forces grant within adults, which gives a contribution towards that, but clearly that is also part of an ongoing commercial negotiations with the sector in terms of the provision of that grant through to the care providers. So that's the position, and as soon as we have any further information on the final settlement, that is where all authorities will see that grant flow through, hopefully with explanation of how that has been calculated. But my suspicions are that will not be sufficient to meet all of the needs as you articulated there, in terms of different authorities therefore will have reported different net expenditure depending on whether they had taken decisions previously about insourcing or outsourcing, for example. In relation to paragraph 3.15 and the future funding review and the recognition of deprivation and council tax base, yes, we clearly have a initial consultation. I can say that through Society of County Treasurers and Association of Local Authority Treasurers, I'm engaged in those discussions. They will progress throughout the next year. I expect an announcement towards the end of this year as a result of that work. We are likely to see, or my expectation is, we will see, for those old enough to remember, a return to a form of the kind of 4-block model, where we see adults, children, AN other, and then the corporate reflected. I say A and other because that could be SEND, that could be highways, it could be both. But it's a recognition that some of the demand and population figures that are often used are possibly too simplistic for certain areas. They don't always reflect need. They also don't certainly reflect incentives. So the sector is certainly feeding into this process. From our perspective, as this is set out in the report, we have a financial shortfall review reserve that should help us in terms of the commissioning, the fall away of any grant. What I can say, and we continue to lobby on this, Cambridge County Council has been an underfunded authority per head of population for many years now. So our position, for example, we did not have the rural grant. So we saw no loss and no gain in the recovery grant that came through. So our fall, if any, in government grant is starting from a very low base in terms of that. But having the reserve there is necessary for any shocks that may come, because we're not yet clear as to whether there'll be any floor and ceilings as it was under the old floor block model. So we don't yet know that detail, but it will come out during this year. I would also note, coming on to your last point, which I will then come on to in a moment, the funding review yet has to address how it will reflect the devolution white paper, and the two, whilst they came out in the same week, didn't necessarily reflect each other. In relation to the statutory override, good summary there of what I've said. Clearly, the override remains until the 1st of April 2026. So they'd have to take a decision proactively to remove it earlier. But we will clearly update full council if there is a need to, as I've identified. My understanding is that those discussions are progressing, and I would expect the end of Feb at the earliest, from what I'm hearing. But clearly, if there is a need, and through the statutory officers, I would absolutely make sure that full council is aware of all facts before any decision. On the final point in relation to the devolution white paper, I can confirm that I wrote this paper, or started writing this paper, during the Christmas to New Year break. I was sober, so no fantasy there. I was well aware of the devolution paper at that stage, but of course also aware of its status. And as somebody, and you look at the leadership team here, who has worked in unitary authority in a newly created unitary authority, fully get the challenges that this will bring and move forward. It clearly, though, is a white paper, and there is an awful long way to go on that. As such, the change programme around the future council strategy is one that would fit with any evolving council in terms of the target operating model and working within place, for example, will be a very strong pillar of any local government reorganisation conversations with peers. And I know from the District Society has been one that has been labelled back about how do you maintain that connection with local communities, and is a very strong pillar of the Future Fit strategy. But clearly others will be affected as well, such as the asset improvement programme. So absolutely, in relation to procurement, it's something that we're aware of. We have a pipeline. We do publish through the open transparency guidelines. We publish around our procurement pipeline. It's something that we are looking at, but it doesn't stop there. There are other issues. We've got to think about how our systems, our property, as you picked up, our debt position, and our liabilities. There is an awful lot to work through, and that doesn't just apply to us in terms of what Councillor Bowden was saying, in terms of that duty to our residents, our communities, reflects across all tiers, both ourselves and the district. And therefore, it was something that I felt I needed to mention as a known unknown, almost as it were. So we know about this, but actually, as we move forward, we now need to gather through the consultations and the further information that will come out from government, as well as the other debates that will happen around in terms of what this will look like and how that will evolve. And we have time to do that before the autumn. But clearly, what I flagged in the report is during 2025, I and others will need to consider the reserves position in light of that, and clearly also the medium-term financial plan. But at this moment in time, I need to give council the advice based on the known knowns. And as of today, the medium-term financial plan and the next item in terms of business and budget planning is that. And the reserve statement is that. I do expect that we will revisit this before the autumn in terms of when we have more known knowns as a result of devolution and local government reorganisation moving forward.
Thank you. I think Stephen may wish to say something as well.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief comment. And actually, it's always interesting to follow your Executive Director of Finance and Resources when he sounds like Donald Rumsfeld when he's talking about unknown unknowns and known knowns. I just wanted to pick up and emphasise the points Michael's rightly made around the Council's change strategy. I think if members recall when you approved that, we were somewhat, clearly we were using our crystal ball rather well by calling it our future council in the first instance, because that's applicable to this authority and clearly any other. Michael's right to note that the 5 thematic strands contained within that change strategy are about firm foundations for any type of local government organisation, whether county, district, or indeed a future unitary. So actually, I would see all of those 5 strands continue to be entirely applicable between now and 2028, assuming government presses forwards with its proposed reorganisation of 2-tier local government across the country. Clearly, we can finesse and shape that accordingly as time goes on, but I would not see that fundamentally changes the strategy that members approved last year at this stage, and certainly doesn't impact adversely on your ability to consider our budget and business plan for the coming financial year, and obviously the assumptions that are built in running beyond that. I accept Councillor Bowden's point that there is a particular date in 2028, but clearly we have a duty to still forecast and make assumptions over the medium term for financial strategy purposes. So I think the papers that you will discuss later, and indeed Michael's statutory assessment that you're receiving here under Section 25, adequately caters for that. I guess the only other observation I was going to make is if members were to go back to the change strategy forward from me, you will probably find that it actually articulates the fact that strategy was formed in the awareness of the likely need to adapt to future problems that cannot be currently predicted. So I would suggest that I'm as Donald Rumsfeld as Michael Hudson in that regard. Thank you.
Chris, are you happy with your responses? I mean, happy is probably the wrong word, but content.
Few people can be happy with the current situation. Just a couple of things. First of all, I very much welcome the comments made by Stephen about the finessing which is required. I wasn't ever suggesting the whole thing would need to be rewritten, but clearly some finessing is going to be required. And I think that whilst it is only a white paper that we have in front of us, the devolution white paper, I think we all know, or those of us who've been involved in the process since then, that government is investing an enormous amount of political capital in this, and it's extremely unlikely that what they're proposing at the moment is going to be abandoned by government. I think that we have to work on the assumption that they are going to go ahead with what they're saying and within the timescale that they're saying. And whilst it's not 100% certain, I think it would be imprudent of us just to brush this off on the grounds that it's merely a white paper. And the one thing which Michael didn't say, and maybe you can say, Lucy, is that we as Cambridgeshire County Council will respond to the local authority funding reform white paper, saying that we do not believe that the shift that they are proposing in council tax support, council financial support for councils, that shift is appropriate, especially given that if any shift is needed, given the pressures that we're under and the fact that we're underfunded, it should, as far as Cambridge is concerned, actually be the other way, in the other direction. And I would be very disappointed if this council isn't making a response, a formal response to the white paper along those lines. That's a political matter rather than anything else.
Thank you. I will just respond on that very quickly before I bring you in, Richard, but just to say on the devolution white paper, I think it's extremely likely that they will be pursuing that, and therefore we will be engaged. I mean, we are already involved in talking about it with our colleagues in our place. On the finance, I think Elisa and I have already been energetic in pushing the case that growth areas, if the government wants to support growth, it needs to make sure that it is supporting councils which are in growth areas, and we will continue to push that case very strongly. Richard.
The first thing I would say on that is that Councillor Bowden correctly reflects the discussion in the Adults and Health Committee. There was cross-party support for some of the points that he was making there. I listened carefully to Michael and Stephen's responses, and I think they're right to advise us that we've got to get on and do our own financial planning and also to carry on delivering the services to the best of our ability. I completely support them to that. But I think the point made in the Adults and Health Committee is that when it comes to procurement, as Councillor Bowden has correctly said, and when it comes to the capital programme, that we are not just making assumptions in our own planning, but we're even binding a future authority. And it's right for us to reflect what are the responsible decisions we should take now and in the short term near future in order to recognise those longer term responsibilities. I absolutely don't think Michael or Stephen or anyone else can give us the answer today on that, but I would want that question to be lodged at this committee and at an appropriate time for the officers to come back and talk to us about that, because it did feel a bit uncomfortable in the Adults and Health Committee where we were agreeing contracts of 7 years, knowing that it's very unlikely this authority will be in existence during the lifetime of those contracts. And so I think there is an open question there, and I think cross-party we're saying that we would like that question to be part of future advice from officers at the right moment. The other two things I would say about this sustainability assessment paper. Thank you very much to Michael, of course. The first one is not being referred to yet, but the issue about the learning disabilities pool issue risk in paragraph 3.15 is obviously a big issue for the authority. I don't think it's right to rehearse too much of that in public today, and we have discussed it before, both in this committee and at full council. But it remains the position that there isn't agreement between us and the Integrated Care Board about financial liabilities relating to people with learning disabilities and their families. Is highly regrettable. A lot of effort is taking place. I want to acknowledge on all sides, not just our side, on all sides, to try and make the best of a bad situation. But we are in a position at the moment where we're in dispute, and therefore it is right to say to this committee and to the council that there is a risk there and that that's properly covered in the budget, I believe, and it is, and in this paper, and I believe it is. I think what's said in this paper about risk is correct. And then the second big truth about the Adults and Health budget is that we're now predicting higher savings in terms of demand for elderly persons services. Again, that's been discussed at length, both in full council and particularly here, and absolutely in the Adults and Health Committee. So this is not a new issue at all. It's properly reflected in this paper, and particularly in terms of the reference to internal audit and the deep dive that has taken place. And since we last discussed this in this committee, officers are now more convinced that it's a deep dive that has reached the right conclusion and that forecasts now are accurate. That's what officers are advising us, and I think it's proper as members that we note that. But there clearly must be a risk that those new forecast savings aren't fully realised. And therefore it is proper for me to say that, because it's a big truth about our budget. It's proper for me to say that in this meeting, but I wouldn't want that to be interpreted as lack of confidence in what the officers are saying to us. I am confident of that, and all these forecasts are, of course, at any time only as good as the current information available, and I think we just have to be grown up and to understand that. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to respond on any of that or not particularly? Yeah.
Just for councillors' knowledge that weren't on Adults and Health Committee, a paper which I was cited on previously was prepared for the committee in terms of and was subject to scrutiny in terms of the assumptions underlying forecast demand and inflation, and that was quite an in-depth piece of paper. Of course, it will always be subject to volatility, and therefore in this paper what you'll see at paragraph 3.36 and at table 3 there is an element of reserves there set aside for that volatility. But I do note in the report that if that is drawn down in 25-26, then that reserve is now getting to a level where it probably won't be able to be called on in future years. So clearly that monitoring of demand assumptions that was presented to committee will prove a crucial part going forward in terms of the budget monitoring. And I won't come in on the procurement then.
Do finish if you do finish if you want to, Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to recognise, and if I didn't say it fully enough in response to Councillor Bowden's question, I absolutely echo that. Clearly we have a duty to continue to run the organisation in its current state. That will require us to take decisions around contracts, from a legal duty, as well as some of the changes that started this month. Yeah, we're still in January. In relation to carrying out efficient and effective and legal procurements. When we look at that, clearly we do need to have an overlay with local government reorganisation. We also need that due diligence where it exists with our peers, so that we can start to make that assessment. That's probably more likely in some of the corporate function contracts. So, for example, the renewal of certain systems as opposed to adult contracts, where it's probably more likely to be issues of innovation and disaggregation and that type of thing to be worked through, which don't tend to carry penalties. But again, the team is attuned and aware of that as part of the negotiation position bringing forward. And one would hope, if we go back to the PwC report of 2019, which is quoted, one of the advantages of unitary status is that economies of scale through larger procurement, but that can only happen at the point in time when that is possible with the least penalties and liabilities. So it is a complex issue to resolve and one we will work through, but having a clear and transparent pipeline enables to have that. Having the process bringing through committee enables us to have that transparency, but also that scrutiny question that has just been posed there about and what happens as a result of.
Thank you. I think Stephen also wanted to make a comment.
Chair, just to build on that and recognising both Councillor Bowden and Councillor Howitt's questions, clearly Michael's given some answer to that already on procurement, but I think it's fair to say that that's something we will be able to further update members upon as we go forward with what we assume will be the government's local government reorganisation programme. I think Michael's right to highlight that there would obviously be issues of novation of existing contracts from legacy councils, so I make that multiple rather than singular, because that wouldn't just be the county council, to the new authorities, but equally there may also be the requirement for procurement to be completed before vesting day for new authorities, which is where the government would then provide coverage through statutory orders for local government reorganisation and Section 24 provisions. So the shadow authorities would actually be the ones taking the ultimate decisions on those contract awards from 2027 onwards, I would anticipate. But again, I think this is a whole local government reorganisation, dare I say, rabbit hole or parallel universe at the moment for committee, and we're focused very much on the 25-26 legal budget and business plan for the county council. But I can confirm we will come back and undoubtedly be having to clarify those issues along with a whole host of others as government moves forward, as Cambridgeshire and Peterborough responds to government. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Steve, sorry. I knew there was somebody else.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if we've moved into debate or question and answers, so I'll start. And if officers pick up a question, maybe unintentionally, then I'll make some comments. The first comment I'd like to make is on the actual recommendations, which I won't be supporting. And if I go through my explanation for that, the sustainability report is the opinion of Section 151 officer, and it's inextricably linked to the business plan. Right. I cannot disagree that the Section 151 officer, who is a professional and good at his job, has certain opinions, and those are laid out in a paper. And if I vote against, it doesn't mean that his opinions are wrong. It's just that I hold different ones, and he has conclusions, and he leads to a set of reserves, but they're different to my approach. So I mean no disrespect to say that I won't be voting for this. And it doesn't mean that it's automatically wrong, in my opinion. It just means that I have a very different way of approaching this. And if we talk about the approach, that might help to explain some of my thinking. So if I was in Michael's shoes and I was Section 151 officer, my approach would be a sustainability report. What do I do with the resources I've got to ensure that the county council is sustainable and delivers services? And that's my primary function if I was fulfilling that role. A secondary function might be to consider how much the council taxpayer has to fund that. And another consideration might be, and what does the joint administration want to deliver? But the primary function is how do I ensure sustainability? And a number of controls can be put in place, including the levels of reserves. Now, the joint administration's approach is a different approach. Their approach is we will increase council tax by the maximum amount available in order to improve services. And we've heard that confirmed by Councillor Machina, Councillor Briona Goodliffe in committee, saying even if we could balance the books, we would increase tax by the maximum amount in order to improve services. My approach, Conservative approach, might be, what do we need to deliver as a statutory duty? Is there anything the public have told us that they are prepared to fund? And we will limit the council tax to that level if we can deliver it effectively. So you can see how these nuanced differences play out, which is why I have a different approach to the sustainability than the Section 151 officer has come up with. I would have liked to have gone over a huge amount of points in the public arena and examine them in more detail. But the point why I'm not going to is, of course, because this is inextricably linked to the business plan, and we're putting forward an amendment. So therefore, when we get to the amendment, we will hear about all the reasonings and the differences and approaches there. But if we take one particular example, which I'll go into here, and this is on page 77, and it's about the track record to deliver savings proposals and managing year spending. So currently, the council is on track to deliver 18 million of savings against its original plan of 34 million. Or alternatively, the council has failed to deliver 16 million out of 34 million pounds worth of savings. That is a substantial amount. If this council had managed to deliver those 16 million pound savings, we wouldn't be seeing an overspend of 6 million pound. We'd actually see a 10 million pound in credit. When I further look at those savings plans, I note that the actual amendments to the business plan put forward by the Conservatives last year had two separate elements. One was on the finances and one was quite a different one. It was very separate. It was the investments into 4 areas of concern that we had not go ahead in order to deliver savings until they've been back in front of the committee. And 2 of those areas was the SEND capacity assessment teams, that the investment was made with no background information. And the other one was the home to school transport, which we'd picked apart and said you weren't going to make those savings. Now, that amendment was voted down by the joint administration. You didn't want to go into detail on those, and you carried on regardless. And here we are at the end of the year with two of these major savings plans having failed when there was an opportunity to scrutinise them further. In fact, in the SEND assessment capacity team, which had an investment of 310,000 last year, we're now looking at a permanent investment of an extra 700,000 pounds a year because of the actual backlog of SEND assessments going on. And I like to think that if we were given the opportunity to examine that in detail, we might have actually said you need to spend more money. You're not going far enough because you're going to send children unassessed for too long a period. We may not have done, who knows? I can't answer in retrospect, but we were denied that opportunity, and we've been proved right that that was something that should have been done. Now, when you look at the fact that you failed to achieve £16 million of savings that you said you could deliver because it was your business plan that we voted against, right? It's kind of washed over. You know, it's almost, we've achieved 18 out of 34. You predicted you would achieve 34. You failed to achieve 16. We're not in charge, you are. But moving on to how that's going to be dealt with, another difference in opinion, in that page 77, £4 million of the general fund as set out in Appendix 2 is assumed as a prudent one-off need to cover future non-delivery of savings. Now, this is something that Councillor Howard brought up. We don't want to be thought that we can't achieve the savings, but your Section 105 one officer has already put £4 million to one side because you don't expect the savings. Now, again, the difference in the way of handling things, which I'd go on to, is if I was told that I can't achieve a balanced budget because £4 million is going to be a drift in savings, I'd try and find another £4 million of savings and over-provide so that we actually land up on budget rather than taking the easy option, as usual, of reserves. And this seems to me that the reserves, we seem to cover reserves for everything under the sun. One of the fundamental things I disagree with, and it's also contained in the paper, is the fact that there is a drawdown, there is a reserves for so many things now. It's hundreds of millions of pounds of reserves. Some of them are earmarked for specific things, but earmarked risk reserves, it states in the paper, it is unlikely that earmarked risk reserves, I can't remember the figure, I think it was £68 million, earmarked risk reserves would never be called upon all in the same year. And you could see the logic of that, that whilst one thing goes wrong somewhere, the likelihood, so for example, if you've got enough money for 4 tyres on your car, it's unlikely that you will ever have 4 tyres blow out at once. It's possible, but it's unlikely. So if you had enough money for 1 or 2 tyres and 1 tyre blew out, you could actually refund and put something into your bank account for 1 or 2 tyres, not hold 4 tyres all year, every year. And that's the level of reserves that we're holding, and that's actually acknowledged in the paper. So there are fundamental differences between our approach as to how this should be handled and the actual sustainability report in front of us. So I say it isn't, I'm not saying it's flawed, I'm just saying it comes from a very different place that lends itself to different conclusions to the ones that I would hold. So therefore I cannot support this. Thank you, Chair.
Do you want to respond to some of that, Michael?
If I may, Chair, and clearly we will also provide advice on any amendments if they're submitted in adequate time, and Councillor Count is aware of that fact. Just a couple of points of clarity, really, if I may, in terms of the general fund and picking up the tyre analogy there. What the general fund there is for any eventualities that may happen. We may be expecting the boiler to go in our own personal lives, and we may be fortunate to have some money that we're able to set aside for that purposes. We hope that it remains as long as possible, but we know that it is going to go, just as we know that if we drive on 4 tyres, at some point all 4 tyres will need replacing, even if we do the economical thing and just replace 1 or 2 at that moment in time. So the general fund position is there to protect us, as just as the earmark reserves are for future items that we think are going to happen. We may have different estimates, and the period may change in terms of our original assumptions, but we have a view that these events need to be protected for. Otherwise, because they're one-off incidents, they give a draw in year, and can, given the size of some of these, the magnitude of that can be something that significantly takes the council off track in any instance. And of course, coming back to Councillor Bowden's point in the debate about devolution, we have a duty in terms of our peers and future councils in terms of what that could look like and that provision enablement for that. What we do with that funds is that enables us to take choices around treasury management, that enables us to effectively manage our cash and our internal position in terms of that against our need to borrow to help manage our costs. So it is there for prudence. It is a prudence which I hope I've set out in terms of the extent of which it is not overly prudent, and therefore we are withholding resources that could otherwise be used. They are there for a purpose. They also enable us to have effective treasury management. So I just wanted to make a few points of clarity, but I appreciate this is on the following item in relation to the business and budget plan.
Okay, I'm just going to respond very briefly to a couple of the points that you made in that comment, Steve. One of which is just to flag up my slight scepticism that you put, you wanted to refer the 310,000 back to committee last year so that you could increase the amount that was spent on that. I think in the budget debate last year, that was not the impression that I got from the way in which that was being put forward. I do want to pick up the point about risk and about the importance of holding significant reserves. The reason that we have to hold significant reserves is because the risks to this council are very wide-ranging and quite unpredictable. And just thinking back to setting this budget last year, I don't think very many of us around the room would have predicted. We did know that there were political risks facing us and that we were operating in a politically uncertain period because we knew that there was likely to be a change of government. I'm not sure how many of us would have predicted that one of the things that we would be discussing in this meeting this year was the imminence of the council being abolished and us not having a longer term time frame. I don't think that was a risk that we would have had on our radar. It is very much a thing that we have to think about now, but it's a kind of indication of the political risks that and uncertainties that we are always operating in. There are also endless risks around climate. We never quite know whether the year is going to bring flooding, drought, or freezing. And we also operate in a world in which the risks to our budgets from the unpredictabilities of the health of our population puts enormous pressure on our budgets in ways that it's very difficult to predict because they're demand-led services. And again, I don't think that 4 years ago, as we were coming out of the pandemic, we would necessarily have predicted that the biggest challenge that the council was facing were rapidly rising levels of anxiety and depression among young people. I think much of our focus was on older people, but actually it's our younger population who have really suffered. So we are operating in a kind of an environment of constantly changing risk pictures, and for that reason, I think it's really important that we do have this assessment from our chief finance officer on whether our levels of reserve are adequate. I think that the worrying thing from this document is that for some of our risks, we can be pretty clear that actually our reserves are not adequate and cannot be. Because there are risks in here, particularly around the SEND override, where we are dependent on the whim of government in terms of how that is dealt with. And we have to be hopeful that government doesn't want to bankrupt this council and a whole range of other ones, because we are absolutely not on our own in being in that position. But the SEND overspend and the statutory override are, by some margin, our biggest risks. And realistically, our reserves are not big enough to cover that. So fingers crossed, government get that message. I don't see any other hands on this paper, and I think we have discussed it quite thoroughly. I think this one we do take a vote on. I'm just going to go back to my papers to check. Note the conclusions of the proposed budget to full council and the proposed level of reserves set out. So I think that is, we do take a vote on that. No, have I got the wrong bit of my papers? Sorry, I'm moving on to, no, I've got item 5.
The recommendations are to scrutinise and
Yeah.
note, which people
Fine.
are welcome to vote
Good.
against.
Okay.
But, you know.
Good. Thank you very much, Elisa. We will scrutinise and note. I think we have thoroughly scrutinised and noted. So it seems that, do you agree that we don't need to vote on it, Michelle?
Chair, it is asking the committee to scrutinise and note rather than to do a vote. The comments that the councillors Count and Bowden have made, I will write obviously up in detail in the minutes, so it will be clear that you do not support aspects, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, Michelle. Thank you for that clarity. Good. Yes, we will definitely vote on the next one. We will move on, I think, to the business plan, which I'm just looking at the clock because my minutes, my notes say we might pause now. I think we will start this debate. We may not complete it depending on how long people want to take. So Stephen or Michael, who's going first? Stephen to start with. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Presenting in conjunction with the Section 151 officer, the County Council's proposed business plan and budget for the period 2025 through to 2030, noting the comments that have arisen in earlier debate today. The report in front of members today sets out the background and various progress updates made with regard to the business planning process, the delivery of the Council's strategic framework, which has previously been approved, a summary of resident and service and policy committee feedback, which has been underway since we last met as Strategy, Resources and Performance, and sets out detailed proposals for achieving a legal budget, including some of the recent financial updates. As the Section 151 officer has already outlined, that includes the provisional local government financial settlement received late in December. In setting out the report in advance of members, I'm just conscious this is an extensive piece of work. It is an extensive piece of work that is required to be undertaken every single year. So I would like to start by saying a thank you to those officers who have contributed to this extensive work in bringing it to this stage. Notably, I would like to thank Joe Lacey-Holland and Tom Kelly and the Policy Insight and Change in Finance and Procurement teams particularly, as well as the Council's executive directors who've worked exceptionally hard to bring this to fruition so that we can present it to members today. The recommendations are clearly extensive and set out a whole range of requirements. Ultimately, though, this is about recommending this for forwarding to full council consideration in February. I would, Chair, just like to point out that whilst the recommendations set out in this report effectively suggest we need a budget of around 1.2 billion in terms of general expenditure for the whole county area for the coming year, 93% of that expenditure actually goes towards the servicing of our various statutory duties and the requirements that we are obliged to deliver under law. So that really gives members an indication that the vast majority of what we provide are required under law rather than a matter of choice or discretion. That therefore builds very nicely on the legislative provisions that the Section 151 officer has already set out in setting his Section 25 financial sustainability assessment that you've already debated. Chair, I am conscious that in proposing this for members' consideration today, we are obviously in a period of significant change again, perhaps more so than any of us had anticipated following the government's publication of the English Devolution White Paper and associated provisions around local government reorganisation. However, local government reorganisation, irrespective of when it comes, will not be overnight and will not be taking place in terms of this council's delivery of services during the immediate financial year that is upon us in April. So it's really important that we are in a position to set a legal budget, continue to deliver those statutory services for which we are collectively accountable, both officers and members, and then really importantly to continue to ensure that we can provide stability and certainty in terms of the council's long-term position, both as a county council and indeed how that may transfer from us as a legacy to any future local authority that's created in the future. Chair, beyond that, you may wish to invite comments from the Section 151 officer around the contents of the report specifically. Other than that, I would like to move the recommendations in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution in full. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that summary, and indeed to all the I would like to echo your thanks to the for the phenomenal amount of work that's gone into producing these papers, not only from the kind of Joe and Tom, and the finance team and all the officers across the council, but also actually to the chairs of all the committees and the committees themselves who've done a lot of work scrutinising the budget so far. Michael, do you want to say anything at this point? Thank you. Open for questions and comments from members. Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy. And I'm going to keep these comments really high level rather than going into the detail. Otherwise, we'd be here all day, which of course is an option, but an option I dare say most members wouldn't prefer. I'd just like to respond to 2 points which have been raised, and I'm not going to repeat things which we had in our previous discussion. The Chief Executive has just said that 93% of the spend that we have in our budget is for our statutory duties, and that's just a matter of fact. But that's not to say that we merely have discretion over the remaining 7%. We have significant discretion over that 93% in how that money is spent, whether it's being spent currently in the most cost-effective way, and whether there should be changes to that. So whilst I fully agree with the Chief Executive's comment that 93% is on statutory duties, that's not to say that 93% of the budget is inviolate and can't be questioned. One element which I would question, and this is not in the direction you might imagine, Lucy, is again to do with risk, but the fact that, again, this council continues not to seem to take into account the policy which it itself has adopted as far as risk is concerned. Because risk is not a one-way thing, it's a two-way thing. Risk isn't just about bad things, risk isn't just about overspends, it's about any failure to match the assumptions which have previously been made, or about what the assumptions may be for the future. And we saw this in the current financial year, particularly in adults and health, with the assumptions that were made on demand in some parts of adult social services, particularly to do with residential accommodation. Now, I'm in no way criticising officers in the assumptions that they made for this current financial year in terms of demand. I would have been in no way better. In fact, I would have had a worse position to make any guesses at, and my guesses would have been guesses rather than assumptions. And I think there's a big distinction between the two. Officers made informed assumptions. I would have made a guess. They're informed assumptions, which were pretty much in line with the informed assumptions which were being made right across the country in county councils. Their informed assumptions turned out to be significantly wrong. And that's not a criticism of them, it's a recognition of the real difficulty in understanding all of the underlying factors which can affect demand. We may be in exactly the same position now. We just don't know. Assumptions have been made, and quite correctly, comments have been made about how we have some degree of backup if it turns out that those assumptions are too generous and that we will end up spending significantly more money because those assumptions have been wrong in one direction. But it's just as likely that the assumptions will be wrong in the other direction. And what we fail to do is to have the flexibility of budget to be able to deal with a recognition as the year goes on that the assumptions which have been made so far as demand is concerned are incorrect. The one thing which is almost certain is that the assumptions which have been made won't be spot on. That would be remarkable if it were true. But I would look for more flexibility here, because what currently seems to happen is that if it turns out that the assumptions we've been made, and they're particularly difficult on adult social services, the effect on the outturn is particularly great in adult social services because of the size of the costs there. And if the assumptions which are made turn out to be too pessimistic in terms of demand, too optimistic in terms of demand, then we just absorb the so-called underspend and take it against overspends elsewhere. And I feel that that's not an appropriate way to deal with budgeting. It's almost as though if the risk turns out to be a positive outcome, oh, let's just offset that against a negative somewhere else. And I would rather see more flexibility during the course of a financial year in terms of responding to the direction of travel which we will begin to see as the year goes on, as to whether those social care assumptions, particularly adult social care assumptions and estimates, are right or wrong. The second thing which I'd be just concerned about is to see yet again the assumption being made, which I think we all pretty much expected, and it's almost the first thing which is assumed in the budget, that the level of the council tax will be increased by the maximum amount which is permitted. And it is a sorry state of affairs when, and it was so predictable this, when that's the first thing which is done rather than the last thing. I'm not saying the council tax shouldn't be increased. I'm not even saying the council tax shouldn't necessarily be increased by the maximum amount permitted. But it is so wrong that that's the first thing which is looked at rather than the last. And I think that that is an underlying error that this joint administration has had over the last 4 years, that rather than seeking to keep the council tax to the lowest increase possible, it's just assumed that we'll increase by the maximum amount possible. And as Councillor Cant said in the previous item, even if it's not actually needed to balance the budget in the year, it's still what would be done. So I think that some cognizance should be taken of what happened with the combined authority mayor when he put out a consultation about his proposal to increase the mayoral precept this year, and got back a 94% response saying no. And I think that the overwhelming majority of people in this county would not want to see further increases in what is a very significant burden to them. Now, they haven't got the advantage, if advantage be the word, of knowing what the detailed financial position is of this council, something we discuss, and we all appreciate what the difficulties are. But it's the burden of the council tax upon residents, not merely here in Cambridgeshire, but right across the country. The burden is becoming less and less affordable and more intolerable. And we have to recognise that fact. And at the moment, the mindset of this council doesn't recognise that fact.
I think I'm going to respond on that first, and then if officers want to, you're welcome to. But I just want to absolutely challenge that assumption that has been made a couple of times already, that members of the joint administration simply assume that we will put council tax up by the maximum. That is not the case. We do take the burdens on the residents of this county very seriously. We understand just how tight budgets are for many, many families across this county. But we also understand just how rubbish our public services are. And there is, there have been lengthy discussions about this budget prior to it being brought forward in the autumn and then through the committees. And it is very much not the case that through those discussions there has been an assumption that we would put council tax up to the maximum regardless of the need. If there was not a need, it would have been wonderful to not put up the council tax, and we would have been very, very, very happy for that position to be the case. And I think that some of the comments about it just being assumed that that's the right thing to do are entirely incorrect. And I think it's important to challenge that at this point. Michael.
The only point I wanted to come back on, Chair, is the point in relation to the adult social care demand. Clearly, that is something that post the pandemic is volatile and uncertain, and that's not just within Cambridgeshire, that's right away across the country in terms of reflecting that. And we are seeing spikes in some areas and not in other areas. So we are continuing to work on that with researchers to refine our data and continue to refine that. Financial monitoring reports were taken to the Adult and Health Committee throughout the year. They identified both pressures in terms of delivering savings, particularly around learning disabilities in relation to the shared partnership and the pooling arrangement. And that clearly was a factor, and therefore the enabling to offset that within that position was something that was considered both in the finance monitoring report for that committee, but also then the integrated finance monitoring report. And that flexibility will always need to be there, whether it's the 5 million of legacy that was in the savings tracker or it's in-year savings proposals as well. And I think it's that openness and transparency that allows us to have that debate and to go through the causes and to continue to be a learning organisation.
Thank you, Chair. Just a factual comment. Of course, one of the things that is attached to this report and which has been provided for members is the analysis of the public consultation that's been undertaken. There was obviously the pre-budget engagement phase that was undertaken, following which over 50% of respondents to that exercise supported a 4.99% council tax increase. And then again, for the formal consultation in phase 2, 57% of respondents who took the time to complete the survey agreed to support a 4.99% council tax increase. And whilst we can talk about response sizes and sample sizes, and I'm sure we could, nonetheless, those are the results of the formal engagement, and those are the results of the people that chose to respond to the council's budget consultation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Steve.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the support I've had, not just from the overall support, Stephen Moore, Michael Hudson, all the officers that go into actually compiling the report in front of us. And I acknowledge that it can be difficult to balance a budget, and you require some savings to do that. So I'd like to thank everybody across the board. I also like to personally thank Stephen Howarth, if he's still in the room, and Joe Lacey Holland, who've been providing support to our group as we look at all the figures more in depth, which goes to some way to explain why we don't ask many questions in depth at these meetings, because we're giving it full scrutiny in the background in order to decide what to do about an amendment at the full budget plan. In terms of scrutiny today, I don't want to add much in terms of detail, but I do want to fundamentally question one of the statements that you've made, Councillor Netzinger. So when I mentioned that the joint administration set out with the view that they want to go for maximum council tax every year, that was based on the fact that we have had your deputy leader, Councillor Machini, say in committee, we would put up the council tax by the maximum amount, even if we didn't need to balance the savings, because we want to improve services. We've had the same statement by Councillor Briony Goodliffe, who is the chair of the Children's Committee. Now, if I don't accept the deputy chair and the chair of a committee as representing the view of the joint administration, then just clarify that for me, because you've just said that isn't the view. So please tell me that they're wrong and you don't share that view, and that isn't the view of the joint administration, because it's never been refuted before at any of the meetings.
I think in order to respond to that, I would need to know exactly what the context was. And I completely understand that there are some contexts. Often there are many issues across this council where increasing the quality of our services is the top priority. And I would certainly say that that's true in some of our children's services. I don't know what context you're quoting, and I don't think Elisa recognises those comments. But if you can provide me with the context for them, then we can respond to them. But I'm not going to respond to them now because there is no context, and Elisa is not saying that she recognises them. What I will say is that there have been detailed and lengthy discussions about this budget, and there was not an assumption from the start that we would be putting up council tax by that amount. And I would be taking the pretty much every Conservative authority that I'm aware of in our region is also putting up council tax by a similar amount. All upper tier councils are facing very, very challenging times. You've only got to look at the state of our roads to understand why we are keen to make sure that we are improving the quality of service that we provide. And that is a key priority for us. I'm just wondering whether there are some other questions, because if not, yeah, Tom. Sorry, Steve, were you? I think Steve was first, and then I'll come back to you, Tom. But
yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm not sure about the context, because those statements were self-explanatory, but I have decided not to tweet the other one, which could be taken out of context, and that was yours just now, just how rubbish our public services are, which was a surprising statement for you to make, but I won't tweet that. That'll probably be out of context. Thank you, Chair.
Just to give that comment some context, that's after, how long is it? 15 years of Conservative government. That is absolutely how many people feel. Tom.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take us to a completely different place, and that's bus shelters. Can be a different tactic. One of my pet peeves, as members know. I was pleased to see I sit on the Highways Committee, and pleased to see Councillor Beckett and Councillor Shayler and colleagues taking forward a potential budget line about how we can improve bus shelters. It's not something that we do now. I think it's something the combined authority perhaps will be looking at doing in terms of maintenance. The problem we have at the moment is when we have new developments, certainly in my patch of Huntingdonshire, we have no mechanism by which to use the commuted sums for these, the Section 106 agreements. So the developers will be willing to put forward a sum for maintenance of shelters, but it's not always possible to use it because we're not clear about who will take forward the maintenance. So I think if this will help clarify that, potentially improve that service, it will be a big boost. As we know, buses are a very big thing in our county. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment, Tom. Michael, I think there were a number of issues that were raised in the Highways Committee meeting, which took place after the publication of these papers, and therefore will need to be picked up and included in the in slightly more detail in the papers that are coming forward for full council. Is that correct? And are you able to speak on the bus shelters? And I think the other ones were to do with street lighting, local highways improvements. There were a collection of issues. I'll come to Michael and then I'll come to you, Peter, if that's all right.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And Michelle's just confirmed that those meeting notes came out on Friday in terms of capturing that and recognising that the investment needed to address a number of areas, as you stated there, and a number of others as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. No, I just wanted to pick up on the LHI point that Alan and I were both at Highways Committee. We had a very good discussion across a range of things at Highways Committee, and I think there was a consensus that, you know, the officer team have done a very good job again on LHIs and parishes are very engaged with the LHI process. But guess what? We're always running up against the glass ceiling of the funding for LHI programs, because we have a luxury problem that parishes are so engaged, so many of them make submissions and make really good submissions. So Frank is aware of this, has been discussed. I think there's consensus across the committee that when we're looking at the highways budget overall, if there's anything that we can do to source more funds for LHI, then we should try that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And it's helpful to know that the papers from Friday are now published. I think it's important that this committee pick up that. I mean, I don't think that there were very many changes that were requested by any of the other committees. I think it was just the Highways Committee, and it's partly to do with the way in which some of the funding came in. So that's very helpful. Steve.
Yeah, technical question, please. Who's responsible for the, and it's come up due to this comment about bus shelters, who is responsible for the installation, maintenance of bus shelters now?
That might be a long answer. Stephen.
Chair, it's a very good question from Councillor Counton. Having unfortunately had to look into this previously, there is no clear answer. It balances sometimes the district councils, historically some ownership by us with legacy bus shelters, I believe, and certainly given that the statutory transport authority for the region is the combined authority, ultimately you would argue that the ownership for bus shelters should potentially move to the combined authority. Rather than trying to give you a more fulsome note on that now, I'm happy to provide a note to members of the committee outside this meeting, bearing in mind I have had this looked into previously following inquiries from Councillor Sanderson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's just worrying that that whilst we would suggest from Stephen Moyer's answer that the combined authority is responsible for the bus shelters, and we need to argue that point, the joint administration and the county council has jumped into the void and suggested that we should be spending pothole money on bus shelters. That's contained in the report from the previous Highways and Transport meeting, and it was contained in the press release issued by the county council what to do with the pothole, £8.1 million pothole money from government that should be spent on bus shelters and other things.
Don't think there's any sense of from anybody that we're planning to spend £8.1 million on bus shelters. Can I just be clear about that? Stephen.
Chair, just a factual clarification. Whilst I appreciate Councillor Count's right to reference potholes, the 8.1 million additional monies from government are allocated for highways revenue purposes, and whilst many authorities will spend the balance of that money on potholes entirely, that is not ring-fenced for pothole expenditure only. It is general highways funding that can be used for a range of reasons, not merely for pothole repairs. So in terms of how the Highways and Transport Committee have looked at that and the notes of their outcomes following meeting last week, I think that's entirely consistent with the way that money's been allocated by government through the combined authority to us as a highways authority. If I've got that wrong, I'm sure the 151 officer will correct me. Thank you.
Chair, I think both the responses, yours and Stephen Moore's, missed the point I was making. It wasn't the fact that it was called pothole money. I too agree it's not ring fence. And I didn't say that £8.1 million was going to be spent on bus shelters. The point I was making was the joint administration had jumped into the void to offer finance in this section from that money when another part of the council is saying, actually, we shouldn't be responsible for this at all. So why jump into the void and offer up money, which is contained in the Highways and Transport response and contained in the press release, when we've just heard today we shouldn't be financing this at all?
I think the question about whether we should be financing it at all is that's open for political debate, and could doubtless come up in the meeting. I think Tom laid out some extremely good reasons why a small amount of funding from this organisation can help unlock significantly larger amounts of money potentially from developers, and that was one of the reasons why I think it's important. But we will. There can be more debate on that under the budget if you prefer. Stephen.
Chair, I thought it might be helpful, mindful that not all members may have viewed the notes from the Highways and Transport Committee last week, just to make clear that, as Councillor MacDonald's indicated, there was quite fulsome debate, which Councillor Sharp was present for as well. And it was the committee's recommendations that the additional £8.1 million that has been allocated to this Highways Authority should be looked at for extra investment in a range of areas, including increase in local highways initiatives, bus shelters, trees, drains, active travel, soil impacted roads, road markings, pothole management and street lighting. I just thought it would be helpful to outline that all of those points will obviously feed through from Highways and Transport Committee to here in the notes you've received, will then feed through to full council, and subject to the decisions of full council in February, a recommendation on the precise allocation of that money will then be discussed at the Highways and Transport Committee in March. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy. We had a fun time together, Lucy, a few days ago at the Combined Authority Board, where, as you will recall, when the budget for the Combined Authority was being discussed, I proposed, and I seconded rather, because Councillor Anna Bailey proposed an amendment to the budget to reduce the amount being given in bus subsidies and to also reduce the amount being taken by the transport authorities of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough in transport levy. And the amount involved was £313,000, not an enormous amount in the scheme of things, but still a lot of money. And as you will recall, that £313,000 was made up by looking at some of the very worst examples of over-subsidy, unjustified subsidy for some bus services. When you have a bus service being subsidised to the tune of £285 per passenger per return journey, and when you have a bus service being subsidised when, on average, in a year, each journey only has 0.96 passengers, then there is a lot of questions to be asked, and I think some of them were correctly answered in our meeting when you agreed, Lucy, as did the Mayor, that this adjustment should be made. Part of the adjustment, the good part as far as Cambridgeshire County Council is concerned, is that £244,000 would be reduced in the transport levy from what we'd budgeted and what we'd expected, so that £244,000 less would be taken from this authority. And I did say at the time that I was hoping that that would be directed towards potholes in particular. Would you be kind enough to ensure that when this is discussed, when we look at at any additional work to do with the finalised budget, that it's made abundantly clear that that additional £244,000 windfall, which I'm pleased to have been able to obtain for the County Council, will be specifically allocated to potholes. Thank you.
I don't have a problem with that. That's fine. Any further questions or comments? Lorna.
Thank you. No questions, but a few comments. I think I want to start from the position that the report in front of us tells us that 86% of the funding for this authority now comes from council tax and business rates. That is a massively high proportion compared to what it used to be, and demonstrates how little, firstly, how little flexibility we have in terms of raising our own funding to pursue our community's own priorities, but also that there are very few places where we can look to find the revenue that is needed to do the things we need to do, and also that residents want us to do. I think that's an important starting point. And I think also that many of us would agree that council tax is far from the most ideal way of raising local revenue to support local services. And I'm sure Councillor Bowden would agree with that, considering that residents in his area pay the highest council tax of all. So
Make a point
I'm
of
sorry.
personal explanation, given it is just, I've just an allegation being made against me, the council I lead. We actually don't do so. It's our council tax band D may be higher, but we have so many properties in council tax A and B that on average we pay less.
And that is exactly the point, that because of the housing composition in Fenland, the rates that are paid, the council tax rate, are very, very skewed, and absolutely the opposite, for example, of South Cambridgeshire at the other end of the scale. So, but there is an issue there about the fairness of council tax, and that is very much, I think, borne out in Fenland as well as elsewhere. We are in a fortunate position that we can set a legal balanced budget, in contrast to places like Thurrock and Woking, who had to issue Section 114 notices under Conservative control. And we've had laid out for us today, and I'm sure there will be much more debate on this and other subjects at the full council budget setting meeting, the Conservatives' low tax, low service approach. And they are entitled to take that view. That is what conservatism is, after all. But I don't think it's an approach that serves residents well, and it's not the approach that this administration has wanted to take. We have set out very clearly that we want to see a greener, fairer and more caring Cambridgeshire. We've set out our 7 ambitions around climate change, around safer, sustainable travel, reducing health inequality, supporting people to live independent lives, addressing poverty and income inequality, creating a more inclusive economy, and to make sure that children and young people in Cambridgeshire thrive. And those are massively important issues, all of them. And I'm really glad that this is an administration that doesn't wash its hands of those responsibilities, saying we haven't got the money to do anything that we don't have to do, but actually takes those head on and delivers for local residents. And I think that if we're talking about doing what residents want us to do, this is the administration that, and I'm really pleased that we have done this for the last 2 years, done a quality of life survey to find out what does matter to local residents, what they do want. And I think some of those responses have been very informative, very interesting, and have certainly guided my thinking about this, and I hope will have guided others as well, particularly around that huge area of poor mental health, particularly among young people, and loneliness, and also, of course, as already been mentioned, roads and the condition of our roads under many, many, many years of serious neglect. Potholes have been mentioned, and I think that, yes, obviously, we don't want potholes in our road, but we need to be thinking about addressing the causes of potholes, not just treating the symptoms, not just painting the spots of what is they're the symptoms of a fundamental breakdown of over a long period of the maintenance of our roads. And we need to be looking at the other things that go to make the roads safer for everyone, and preventing potholes occurring in the first place. And I will say weight limit through Sutton would be very nice. Thank you. The final thing I wanted to mention, and I was very pleased that the Chief Executive did draw attention to this, was the response of the committees, because I think we are now in a much healthier place in terms of developing the budget, in terms of enabling committees to fulfill their role of scrutinising the budget proposals in the month or month and a half leading up to the full council committee. And I think it's been interesting to see the different ways in which different committees have done that. There was almost radio silence from some members at the Environment and Green Investment Committee about the proposals. On the other hand, and at the other end of the scale, there was really positive debate at the Highways and Transport Committee, and some good suggestions on all sides, and a large measure of agreement on all sides about the things that would be desirable to do, including, and I believe this very firmly, increasing the pot for the local highways improvements. We have seen so much local work go into those schemes, and then so much disappointment when large proportions of them fail to make the cut. And local communities know their area, they know what they want, they know what will work. And I do hope that we can find resources to put more into those very much locally worked up and locally wanted schemes, and avoid disappointing people to the extent that we have. So that would be a very firm plug for me. But it was a very productive debate, a very positive piece of exchange of views between everybody, and I really think that that is an extremely welcome development, and I hope that we'll be able to take those responses in particular into consideration when the budget appears in its final form. I think overall that committee, and to a lesser extent maybe some of the others, have done, I haven't watched all of them, I hasten to add, and I may be doing other committees a disservice, but I think there's been some really robust work in some quarters on this in terms of scrutinising the proposals, and I think we're now in the best place that we could be, given the constraints that we face, to move forwards and set the legal balanced budget, which I'm very pleased we can do.
Thank you very much. I think definitely more comment than questions, but which is great, but yes, absolutely, really helpful. Yes, Elisa.
I will try to be brief, but I think it's necessary that we, this thing that we're doing right now is probably the most important thing that this committee does the whole year. To recommend the budget to full council is a very important option, and I think it's very important that we do that process justice. Just a few comments in addition to some of the things that have already been said, which I will not repeat. I think we have made no mystery or not hidden at all over the last few years that, in this council we have been running increasingly fast over the last couple of years just to stand still. And, when you have to run as fast as we have to run in order to stand still and keep providing the same level of service, or in some respects what we would consider barely adequate levels of service in the face of extremely unfair national funding circumstances, it is not at all strange that we would say, that one of our main priorities is to improve the level of service that is provided. And for that, we have to raise council tax. And, I'm not surprised. It is not the first time that we get this twisting of our words from the opposition. That's partly what the opposition will do. That's fine. I think the important thing to note is, first of all, I would like to very much thank Michael and his team, Tom, who is here, Stephen, who is here. Thank you so much for all the work that you have done. It is very important that we have this debate here where we have the ability to question Stephen and Michael and everybody else, because we know that their ability to intervene at full council is very constitutionally limited. So this part of the debate is a very fundamental part of what happens at full council later and should be recognised as such. It is also very important to understand, and this is something I want to bring back to some of the comments that were made earlier. There are a lot of deceptively attractive bright lights in the sky at the moment that we are being enticed to follow, and we have to warn against becoming over-obsessed with them. I know that we have some important changes that have been signaled by government ahead of us. It is very important that we take notice of them. It's very important that we do what we're being asked to do when we are asked to do it. It is important that we consider those things with level-headedness, and that we don't start going off in that direction every time something else comes under it. we don't just have to set the balanced budget for the next financial year, we also have to make sure that our strategy over 20, there will be a local authority in this physical place, or sometimes more than once, in 2030, and they will inherit a large part of what we do. We have a responsibility to ensure that that is something that we make sure, insofar as we are able to, that it is sustainable. And this is what we're trying to do, and we are trying to do that within the means that we have got. And I'm very pleased that we take a holistic approach, that we talk to our colleagues, that we step in to supplant sometimes what are governance quirks in our region. Our region has a very complex environment. We know that. We've been joking about it for ages. And sometimes that does require us to put money where we would potentially statutorily get away without doing so. But, you know, if the opposition wish to be quoted as opposing the fact that we should support the development of some of the bus routes in our region, then I'm very happy for them to be quoted as saying that. And for everything else, I do think that we will now have a very informative debate at full council, and I do look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. I don't see any other hands. I haven't heard, I know that there will be not universal support for these recommendations, but I haven't heard any requests to take different parts of the recommendations separately. So given that there seems to be consensus around taking them together, I will now put the recommendations, which are lengthy, and therefore I'm not going to read out to the vote. So all of those on this committee who are happy to support the recommendations in front of us and recommend this budget to council, if you could indicate now, please. Thank you. And all those against? And I don't think I need to take any abstentions because I think that's everyone.
The result of the vote is 9 votes in favour, 5 against, no abstentions. The motion is therefore carried.
Thank you very much. So we will send the budget on its way to full council. Thank you for that. I think then that we are now on to item 7 on our agenda, which is the agenda plan and training plan. Michelle.
Just a couple of things to note, that in relation to your meeting on the 11th of March, there will be an additional report on Digital Future. And also the monitoring officer has called a special meeting of this committee, which will take place on the afternoon of that same date, the 11th of March, to consider the waste finance PFI.
Steve.
Am I right in thinking that the members of the special meeting is not the members of the other meeting?
Chair, it will be a mixture. So obviously, in relation to the special meeting, if you are a Twin Hatter, you won't be eligible to sit on that meeting. So there may be members who are at the first meeting who aren't Twin Hatters who will also be in the second meeting.
Given some of our conversation earlier, I'm just wondering whether we might want to put something on the agenda about local government reorganisation, but it's difficult to know. I imagine that do we need to put it on now if we want it, and then it's easier to take it off, or is it better, or can we put it on later?
I think my understanding is that probably anything will need to go to council, so it wouldn't be a key decision. So there is flexibility as to when, if it goes on this committee agenda.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy. We can't tell what's going to happen, at what pace it's going to happen, when announcements will be made. And as you will be as aware as I am, it's a constantly moving feast and will move more before it becomes settled. And that's why it is quite important that it is on at least this committee's agenda from now onwards at every meeting, to have an up-to-date report as to where we currently are, not merely to inform members of this committee, but also as a means of communicating with the council more widely and also the general public. Because one thing which is massively lacking is any really useful communication with the general public. Now, government has said that there will be public consultation on this, but we won't be allowed to organise that. It will be organised at a national level, and we've been told the one thing the public won't be allowed to talk about is whether they want what's being proposed or not. So I have a fear that the public is largely being ignored in this whole process, and we need to do the best we can to ensure that the public and other councillors, including members of this committee, are aware of where we're up to at a particular time. And I'd like you also to take this opportunity, if you feel able to, Lucy, to confirm publicly that there's an awful lot of cross-party cooperation and working in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough about our approach to this, and we are working very well together regardless of any party political differences we may have. We are collectively much more interested in the interests of the people of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, Cambridgeshire in particular.
Thank you. I'm happy to confirm the latter. I think I had Steve. Do you want to say something, and then I'll come to you, Richard?
Yeah, it seems to me that that would be a useful way forward. Hopefully you can agree. The other thing I would say is that it doesn't seem to me that between for the March committee that there would be a much point in the local government reform being on then. We have elections in May. There may be similar or people in various seats post-May, and I would suggest that a briefing training, particularly for the role of the committee most involved in this, which I'm going to jump to a conclusion. It may be SRMP, but I may be wrong. But also a member-wide briefing, because you'll have a lot of new members, and this will be quite a hot topic moving forward. Thank you.
I'm going to come to Michelle to pick that one up, and then I've got Richard and then Stephen.
Yes, absolutely. The Chief Executive has identified the need for that, and the member induction programme has been amended accordingly, and there will be a briefing quite early on in the induction process.
Richard.
It's going to do nothing for Councillor Bowden's reputation, but I'm agreeing with him today. Perhaps I've got something coming on. But in all seriousness, I agree with him that the public deserve to hear some of the detailed and often constructive discussions which are taking place in private. As long as we don't raise an expectation either with them or amongst ourselves that we're going to have a blueprint or anything like that, and as long as we have some self-discipline, because, you know, obviously Labour thinks that this is going to better serve the public interest. We've heard a different view from the Conservatives. If we just take bits off each other in public, then actually it won't be a good idea to put it on the agenda. But if we can have a short, focused discussion which enables some of the arguments to come out into the public, then I think that's a constructive and proper thing to do. So I hope it will be on the March committee agenda.
Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. So a few observations. First of all, we await further clarity from government, as Councillor Count has indicated. So I think that clarity, if government delivers against its own deadlines, should be forthcoming by the end of this week. We await that with interest. In terms of the County Council's own position, yes, we are, of course, working alongside the other councils in the area, but across the entirety of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Just to be clear, that's not just the county and the district. I would just add that it's helpful Michelle's noted the point around the member induction programme post-elections in May, which we've already taken forward. I would also just remind members that I did an all-member briefing on the 17th of this month that was recorded for any councillor who was unable to attend, to be able to get better factual understanding of the position on local government reorganisation and the broader elements of the white paper. We are in the process of setting up bespoke web pages on the County Council's own website in readiness for information for public dissemination. We will obviously want to work alongside our partner councils in that regard as well. And yes, I think we will want to continue to look at our own governance and management arrangements for this as it goes forward. I do think that's an important point to recognise, because actually decisions on this matter, particularly at this stage, would be for full council to make, not for individual committees. So whilst we may be able to provide some form of update report at appropriate points in time, there will be clearly significant junctures in March which will be important for full council potentially to consider, and then again in the autumn once we have clarity about submission of proposals to government. So I'm minded, Chair, that we may not need a report for every meeting of this council, and indeed we need to reconcile that with how we might set up internal governance from the county council to manage LGR. So I think number of moving parts, but I think we're all recognising there is a need to ensure communication with members across the whole of the council, both pre and post election, and then think about how we can best communicate with our residents as well. So all of those are things that we're actively working on. I must admit, when I say actively working on, some of us seem to be spending almost the entirety of our time working on this and then doing our day job on top, but that's just how it goes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Graham.
Sorry, Lucy. Just finally on local government reorganisation, I wonder if it's one of the topics that should be included within the corporate risk register, bearing in mind how significant it is for us.
Certainly. Stephen.
Chair, Councillor Wilson will be delighted to hear I beat him to it. We're already revisiting the entirety of the corporate risk register with that lens applied. We had made some provision for it within existing corporate risks in terms of significant changes by government, but clearly now we have a significant change by government. We're revisiting the entirety of the corporate risk register. I actually picked that up with the head of internal audit and risk management a fortnight ago. So as the risk becomes clearer, we'll obviously articulate that properly, and then clearly the revised corporate risk register for the council will come here and to audit and accounts committee, where it will give them full and proper scrutiny. Importantly though, just as we do with other major issues, I would anticipate as we move forward into any phase of local government reorganisation, we will need a bespoke risk register just for that item for the county council, and then more broadly probably one shared with our partner authorities across the whole of the area. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, before the white paper was published, various people told me that let's hope that they don't go for local government reform because it will just swamp everything else and suck all the energy and kind of innovation out of the system for ages. And I had been slightly skeptical about it, and I now see they were exactly right. It is extraordinary just how it has taken over the last month. And it's weird that it's only seems a month. Steve, and then I'll come back to.
Not really to do with the training or agenda plan, but seeing as we're on topic, and Stephen was just confirmed a review of the risk register. We were told earlier on today about the accounting change to profit and loss on assets held by the company. I would imagine that would pose a significant risk if an investment was revalued lower and that turns up on a balance sheet. That's a significant risk. I'm not sure if that's recognised or if that is a serious risk. Could you just take that way and consider it while you're doing the whole thing? Thank you.
Thank you. We will deal with that one outside of the meeting because it is quite a long way from the agenda plan. I think given the discussion we've just had, I will ask Michelle that we could put something on local government reform on the agenda plan for March. It is always possible to not take it in March if there isn't a reason to, but and I would be very surprised if there isn't something on which we can update the committee. Given the conversation we've just had, I think it's probably helpful to have a space on the agenda where we can officially talk about that rather than just under the agenda plan. So if that's all right, Michelle, we will add that to the agenda. But it may be that what happens is that we have a relatively short report because there's a bigger thing going to council. At which point I think we can conclude today's business. So thank you all very much for your time. Michelle, I apologise for going 11 minutes over the 2 hours, but we do now finish the meeting. So that's very helpful. Thank you all. See you for the budget debate quite soon. Thank you.